live.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Public Safety Committee meeting. This afternoon we have one item on the agenda, and it's the expedited bill 3420, the Police Disciplinary Procedures, Police Labor Relations Duty to Bargain with amendments. And what I do plan on having happen today, and if the committee, the Public Safety Committee has concerns about this, they're certainly not going to be shy and let me know. But it's my intention not to have a vote on this. It's my intention to have the discussion on it today, and then see where that brings us for on the legislation. As we begin, I'm going to ask if any of the committee members, which consist of President Hucker and Vice President Albornoz, and we're also being joined by Councilmember Rice, who's one of the lead sponsors of this legislation. If any of them have any opening comments, and with that, do any of the committee members have an opening comment? Vice President Albornoz.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. First, let me just express my appreciation for that approach. I know that there will be some significant amendments to the bill as adjusted based on what occurred in Annapolis this most recent session. And obviously a lot that we have to sort through and unpack as part of those amendments. But I requested to speak up front because I just wanted to share some thoughts and reflections and context, at least from the direction from which I'm going to be viewing this particular bill and this discussion overall. I do want to begin by very much acknowledging and thanking Council Members Rice and Reamer for the introduction to this bill, as well as the co-sponsors, because it follows in line with the authentic and sincere approach that the Council has tried to take in ensuring accountability and ensuring transparency and ensuring that we meet this moment in time as we, as a country, address the systemic issues over generations that have led to a lot of the disparities in police work that we've seen in our communities of color.
Excuse me, Council Member, can I interrupt, please? I've just been told that they are not seeing this meeting, I guess, on TV. Can someone please check that?
I was on a roll, Sydney.
I'm sorry, and I don't mean that I went into the world to hear everything you had to say.
You're doing great.
Yeah, I'm going to hit the rewind button in a little bit, so apologies to everybody because I'm going to try to repeat what I just said.
That's fine, and I want you to. It's my understanding, Fed is being shown, but it's labeled as public safety. So if Sky or someone can please change that or fix that. And
yes, I have an update.
This is, I believe.
Yes, Tom, Council President Hucker.
Oh, no, I hope everybody's patient today because I believe this is the first day we've tried to stream two meetings at the same time.
Yes, that's correct. And the update I have is that we are streaming the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee on county cable. This meeting will appear on YouTube and Facebook.
Everyone, could you please repeat that one more time, Council President?
All I was adding, Mr. Chairman, is just that I was urging everyone to be patient because in my understanding of our staff technological limitations, this is the first day in a year and a half when we've attempted to stream two meetings at the same time on multiple platforms simultaneously.
And I think what is added to the confusion is that they mislabeled what's on television as public safety, and it is the Fed meeting. And of course, so at any rate, for those who are just tuning in, we are not going to take a vote on this today, and that could be another reason that we don't. But and with that, I'm going to turn back to Vice President Albornoz with my apology for interrupting, and please start over for your statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I'm going to repeat everything that I just said. I apologize, but I want to make sure the context is there. The first is just appreciating you, Mr. Chairman, for the approach that you're taking for this particular discussion. As was noted, this bill has been significantly amended because obviously there has been a change in policy at the state level, which will supersede a lot of the intent of the original bill. And so I want to express my appreciation to the bill's co-sponsors and co-leads, Council Members Rice and Reamer, and the co-sponsors of the bill for continuing what has been this council's attempt to ensure transparency, to ensure continuity, to try and build on the trust that is so necessary between law enforcement and our community to be able to effectively provide public safety across all of our communities. And we've all been working diligently to try and meet this moment. And I